Good afternoon and welcome to History and Systems of Psychology. We are in week 8. It is midterm time, day 2, and spring break is almost upon us. One more week. Anyone doing anything fun? Travel-wise? Sleeping? Maybe that's fun, yeah. It's kind of bad when we're actually like looking forward to that. It's like, I plan to sleep. And that sounds like the best thing ever. But probably most of us need that a whole lot, right? Okay. Well, today we are going to continue our conversation on Galton and individual differences and intelligence. So I'd like to go ahead and get started there. All right, so you watched a video on Galton and learned a little bit about the anthropometric laboratory, correct, in eugenics. What I want to do today is fill in some of the blanks. As we've been covering with the other psychologists and philosophers, background, family background is really important. So I want to go ahead and circle back to Galton, where he was born, what his early life looked like, because as is the case of so many others, that plays a big role on where his interests lie and what he does with his adult life. All right. Galton was born in England. He lived a nice long life, born in 1822 and died in 1911. I can only imagine being alive during that span of time, the many differences and changes that he saw in society over that period. Probably pretty exciting time to be alive. His father was a very wealthy banker. Think oodles of wealth. And he was also the younger cousin of Darwin. And that lineage is going to play an important role in actually the establishment of the anthropometric laboratory. He was known as a child prodigy. In the book, it talks about the fact that he was able to speak some Latin by the age of 5. He could talk about works such as the Iliad and the Odyssey at the ripe age of 6 and sort of make sense of what those stories meant. He had a very sharp mind and a great early start, but in a lot of ways, Galton shared some of Darwin's characteristics as a child and adolescent. Just not that dedicated to school. He had other interests. In fact, his schoolboy diaries contained hardly a reference to an intellectual or scholarly idea. That sounds kind of harsh, right? If you'd like to follow along in the book, we are on page, let's see, 246. In the last paragraph, despite his sharp mind and promising early start, Galton was no happier or more successful than Darwin had been when sent to traditional schools emphasizing discipline, rote learning, and the classics. His schoolboy diaries, instead of containing all of these ideas and academic type things like we might see with Descartes, described floggings, that doesn't sound good, canings, punitive assignments, fights with local boys, and general hell-raising. Okay. He did well only at mathematics, which sounds good, and it was good, but at that time, studying the classics was deemed more important. Needless to say, he was not a star standout student, given his impressive beginnings. All right, so his father removed him from school. You're not going to go to that school and, no more flogging and caning for you, probably a good thing. We're going to enroll you in medical school, though. So we're going to pull you out of school, regular school, and enroll you in medical school. He did not like medical school. Galton was not a huge fan, and the book talks about the fact that he had to grit his teeth and adapt to the situation. Now, mind you, this was back in the day where medicine was in its infancy as far as anesthesia and things of that nature were concerned. So he would see operations where no anesthesia was administered, and you can only imagine the trauma that would instill in someone who really wasn't that into medicine to start with. The way that he coped with medical school and some of the horrors that he witnessed was that he chose to detach himself from the situation. Okay, I'm going to depersonalize myself. I'm going to look at this education and look at these patients as an objective observer. And that was something that he held on to. It became a hallmark in terms of the way he lived his life. At age 18, his medical training was interrupted. Now he decides he wants to earn the highest honors in math. So he goes to Cambridge, and he has a really good start. He's off to a really great start, but in the end, he peaks. He has what can only be called, in a kind way, a mental breakdown. And he graduates just, not that graduating from Cambridge isn't a big deal, because it is, but he didn't graduate with highest honors. He was not at the top of his class in terms of mathematics. So what does one do after that? Well, let's go ahead and we'll try medicine again. All right. So a lot of the reason he was able to bounce around like this was due to his father's wealth and influence, right? This would not have been the case for many people to have this many opportunities, chances to explore different things, and then being unsuccessful at one thing, well, let's revisit another at a later date. All right, so now he's back, he's situated in medical school, and his father dies. His father dies in 1845, and Galton was left with an enormous fortune. A lot of money, not a lot of investment in anything academically, right? So he chose to walk away from academic life. He didn't finish medical school, and he decided he was going to travel and also really enjoy life. In our text at the bottom of page 248, it says, his spirit seemed broken when his father died, and he left academic life, as I've already mentioned. For the next several years, Galton was a member of the idle rich. He hunted and gambled. Ooh, all right. And he engaged in the dangerous sport of ballooning. All right. Traveled extensively from Scandinavia in the north to Egypt and the Sudan in the southeast. All these travels, all these experiences, he was deeming as somewhat aimless activity. Well, it just so happens that he comes across a phrenologist. All right, now what's a phrenologist? We've talked about phrenology, right?
Abilities.
Right, right. And we talked a lot about phrenology. In a way, it paved the road toward understanding that our brain has localized functions, right? The brain is mapped for certain things to occur in certain parts of the brain, but the idea of phrenology spun out of control and ended up being much more a circus show sort of side act, so to speak. But lo and behold, he visits this phrenologist. He wanted a reading of his natural abilities, aptitudes, and inclinations. Okay? The shrewd phrenologist, undoubtedly relying on more than just the shape of Galton's head, reported that brains constituted like his innately lacked
spontaneous activity in relation to scholastic affairs. So your brain is simply not shaped in a way that says you really should excel at math or should excel in medical school. Rather, your brain is suited for vigorous activity. All right? It is only when rough work has to be done that all the energies and capacities of minds such as yours are brought to light. And this was a comfort to Galton. He could now attribute his somewhat sketchy academic record to the fact that he just lacked innate ability, even though it's pretty funny considering that people saw him as a prodigy at the age 3. But for some reason, this was very reassuring to him. Okay, well, no wonder those things didn't work out like I had planned. I need to be doing vigorous activity. So he was able to take that as a comfort, and he didn't have to look at the fact that, you know, maybe some of it's like your lack of effort or your inability to stick to things. Since he enjoyed traveling, what did he do? He became an explorer of Africa. He became an African explorer. And he won a Royal Geographical Society gold medal. He mapped and measured the country, and that was something that, like cartography and things like that, were definitely valued at this time period. This gained him entry into the governing society of the governing council of the Royal Geographical Society, which was a really big thing. All right, so he took a lot of pride in being able to do that and being part of that and having people ask him for advice, right? He also wrote a handbook entitled The Art of Travel that was really well received. So it sounds like he had some talent as a writer, right? The Classic Guide revised over the course of 8 editions, offered practical advice on such diverse subjects as pitching a tent in the sand. Very important when you're surrounded by lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, right? Avoiding the rush of an enraged animal. And preventing one's asses, I think that means like not one's own, but rather animals, donkeys, from braying all night. All right, so some really practical advice for people who are adventuring in the wild, right? As probably not a lot of people did, but you're taking an expedition to Africa, you need to know how to pitch a tent, you need to keep those donkeys quiet but alert, right? And you need to figure out how you avoid getting eaten by something with lots of spots on it and fur. Okay. So just to trace what's going on, child prodigy, goes to school, doesn't excel in school, gets in a lot of trouble, lots of punishments. Dad says, you know, why don't you leave school and we're going to try some medical training. Tries medical training at the age of 16. Father dies, decides he's going to go off and live the idle rich life. Okay, does that for a while, and consults with a phrenologist, decides he needs to be this adventurous explorer kind of person, because that's what the shape of his head meant, right? You were meant for these kinds of safaris and such, and goes on to write a handbook, and then gets into the topic of weather, all right? We've talked about weather, it's been many chapters back when we were talking more about the cosmos, right? So he has all of this money, he's able to explore whatever pursuit is of interest for him at the time, which is a luxury not many people had or have. He collected lots of information from different places in the world and represented weather in various parts of the world on a map. And he discovered alternating patterns of high pressure and low pressure systems that we use now to determine weather changes. So pretty interesting, right? Okay. He probably would have gone on to continue to explore, studied weather, or maybe he would have been someone who found another interest. Had it not been for the publication of Darwin's work that is entitled Origin of the what? Of the Species, all right? This changed his life. The textbook calls it, when that book came out, it was a bombshell moment. Something had landed, and once that happened, his efforts were diverted into an avenue that he remained consistent in throughout the remainder of his life. Now, good or bad, it depends on who you ask, all right? And Galton at first was troubled by the ideas. Tell me how Darwin's ideas were received when his book first came out. His ideas on evolution.
In a way, it could have been like blasphemy because, like,
Okay.
going against like humans being God's creation and stuff like that.
Yeah, so there was definitely a faction of society that was like, this is blasphemous. And you can imagine if it goes against everything you've been led to believe, makes up life.
Okay, so your idea of life is based on something that now this person is saying didn't really happen. You can understand why that would be cause for concern, and a lot of people might be like, you know, this is worthless stuff. I don't know why he's coming out with that. At the same time, in other audiences, the ideas were well received. But to suffice to say, Darwin dealt with all kinds of responses to his book coming out. Okay, so like I said, at first Galton was troubled by some of the ideas. He thought this idea of evolution had a lot of merit. And remember that Darwin had all sorts of specimens, all sorts of research to back up his claims, right? He had research on evolution that ranged from geographical research, right? So we're going to look at the Earth itself, and then we're going to look at fossils, and then we're going to look at insects, and we're going to look at zebras, and we're going to look at earthworms, and we're going to look at sea urchins. So a plethora of things, and all of this backed up this idea. So it took Galton a little bit of time, but he came to believe strongly in the idea of evolution. And that sounds really good, right? And maybe if he'd stopped there, it would be a really good thing. He came to believe that the most distinctive human variations were intellectual and psychological in nature. He was really interested in seeing what makes us different from one another. Now, when we study subsets of psychology like personality psychology, sometimes you'll have personality theorists that want to see what makes us similar. Others are looking more at individual differences, and so he was of the individual difference variety. And he thought, well, most of what makes us different has to do with our natures, our intellectual nature and our psychological nature. Based on his own personal experience, he determined that individual differences in intellectual ability must be primarily innate. Now, this reminds me a little bit of someone who said that people with bulging eyes were very smart. Who said that?
I don't know.
Our phrenologist?
I feel like you're on the right track. Yes?
And it was Gall that said that, right? Yeah. It was Florens that started attacking.
Sorry.
No, just don't doubt yourself on that, okay? So, yeah, Gall was, so we can think of Gall and Galton
As both sharing some sometimes cringeworthy beliefs, all right? And it took Florens to come back and start poking holes in what he had to say, right? But that idea of phrenology, right? We're going to look and we're going to see these people who are smarter than me have these bulging eyes, so that must be like a hallmark of people who are smart, All right, so I see a lot of parallels, and I think you'll see it here as well. And those who perform better must have superior innate natural ability for academic success. So this idea of academic success not being something that can be learned, right? This idea of a growth mindset, we can expand our intellect, but rather it's this fixed thing, and some people are wired to do really well academically. He also observed that intellectual achievement tended to run in families, and he did extensive research on this. He read lots of biographies, he looked at lots of different successful families, and, you know, in terms of generations, how did the like fame in a particular area, you know, maybe someone who excelled in math a couple of generations down also has grandchildren who are excelling in math or in a related field. And he found those sorts of things to be consistent, but rather than thinking it might have to do with their environment, what they're raised around, he thought, well, that's just further evidence that this is a genetic thing. All right? Any questions about all of that? All right. Having done this research, having done a lot of thinking about individual differences, Galton became captivated by the idea of identifying human psychological variables that were potentially heritable. All right, so these things that we inherit. These things that we inherit, therefore, would be relevant to human evolution. His thought was that natural ability was among the most important of these variables. And natural ability, for the exam, you'll need to know that he defined it as qualities of intellect and reasoning that enable a person to excel in society. Now, he's leaving out a lot of stuff when he's thinking about this, right? I mean, think about how different one society can be from the next. I mean, are there levels of intellect and reasoning that are going to make you rise to the top in any society? He didn't really question things like that. Society to him was, I see it as sort of a generic thing, okay? Now, this is a place where he really veered off, and I want to talk about this in more detail. We've covered in past chapters work that was done on sensation and perception, right? Remember the mental chronometer that was used to capture, you know, how quickly people could sense that a stimuli was there, right? Or a stimulus. Okay, let me find the page number for this. Okay. Okay, so he reasoned that people with highest natural intellectual abilities would also have the most efficient brains and nervous systems. Okay, so this nervous system's going to be able to sense things more quickly, right, about the world around them. And that was not an assumption that he was not the only one who had that erroneous assumption. At the top of page 245, it talks about the fact that this was a widely held prejudice, that there was this correlation between sensory discrimination and intelligence. First, he believed mentally handicapped people were deficient in their senses as well as their intellect. This was well before the idea that we have people first language, you know, individuals with disabilities, and the term disability was not really used. So as I am reading this, just remember to consider the context. In his words, the discriminative faculty of idiots is curiously low. They hardly distinguish between heat and cold. So these people have a rudimentary ability to distinguish between various sensations. And their sense of pain is so obtuse that some of the more idiotic seem hardly to know what it is. So this linkage between sensation and intelligence was something that he believed, but also was a larger prejudice that was just sort of something going on in society at the time. Secondly, he believed in the inferiority of women. How dare he, right? But again, this was a fairly popular stereotype. Okay, held the sexist belief held by a lot of Victorian male counterparts that women were not only less intelligent than men, but also less acute in their senses. And I love how he justified this. He says, otherwise, how could one explain the fact that women seldom held jobs requiring fine sensory discrimination? And he gives the jobs such as piano tuning, wool sorting, or wine tasting. Ladies rarely distinguish the merits of wine at the dinner table, and though custom allows them to preside at the breakfast table, men think of them on the whole to be far from successful makers of tea and coffee. All right. Yeah, I know, eyebrows raised, that's okay. All right, so they are lucky to preside over the table because they're inferior in all these different ways, right? Even distinguishing like the finer points of coffee or tea, okay? So he felt justified in assessing mental ability by measuring people's abilities to do things such as bisect a line, discriminate weights of different objects, discriminate between colors, and hear different pitches of sound, okay? Galton believed that individual differences on his test, when he would assess people in the anthropometric laboratory, were not errors or irregularities. So these differences didn't point to there's something wrong, but rather they were the very machinery of evolution. And it was these differences, rather than how we're similar, that should be our prime area of interest, okay? His new approach to this became known as the psychology of individual differences. And everyone, there's nothing inherently wrong about studying individual differences. This is something, again, a lot of his work we have to take with a grain of salt, and it did do a lot of damage, but there also are aspects of his work that we still hold on to. So that is one thing I want you to be able to balance those two things in your mind. Any questions on any of this? All right, so we get to eugenics, sort of through a back door. And can you imagine if Charles Darwin would have thought he opened this, like his idea of evolution turning into eugenics? Yeah. Would have seen it as a terrible turn of events. Galton thought, well, we can improve the human race through selective breeding. All right, so we're going to find people who have these innate abilities, right, to detect differences in the apple tones of wine, or they have the ability to bisect a line like no one else's business. And we are going to make sure that those people have babies with other people who also do that stuff really, really well. Okay, and in your mind, like, well, that sort of makes sense, right? But in practice, it's very dangerous and pretty appalling. And so for all of Galton's sort of trying out this and that through his early life, it was eugenics, it was the work of evolution and what came out of that that guided him throughout the second half of his life. I mean, he was just all the way in on this idea of individual differences and how we can capitalize. So we're going to get the best of the best. EU means good, so good genetics. All right, so like I said, it became an all-consuming passion in his second half of life. As an aside, two of Galton's ideas that were most important for the history of psychology was the idea of testing intelligence. So again, in and of itself, that's not a bad thing to do. And the concept of statistical correlation. Now, the way he used correlation was different than we would advise, but this idea of a correlation between two things, that was very groundbreaking at the time. Well, he wrote another book, and this didn't have anything to do with traveling. It was entitled Hereditary Genius. Fairly racist, fairly prejudiced, as you can imagine. Included a section entitled The Comparative Worth of Different Races, and ranked Europeans at the top. He was from England, that makes sense, right? Substantially higher than Asian and especially African groups. Galton's vision was of a positive eugenics. So he meant for this to be something positive, something good that was going to happen for the world. But what happened, in reality, it became very negative. Okay? And we can see this come to a head in Nazi Germany, where we have this idea of race hygiene. And what does that mean? If we want something that's hygienic, what is that?
Sticking to your own, I guess.
Like pure, right? Yeah, so we want something that's pure, we want something that's not tainted, right? And so this idea in Nazi Germany went to the extreme, right, during World War II. There were concentration camps, there were so many experiments that were done in the name of science to test different ways of maybe trying to make an ideal race. They would put eye color or dye in people's eyes to try to change them to blue. They did all sorts of things. And also people who they deemed as lesser, they would sterilize. People with disabilities would often be sterilized. They did a lot of twin studies with some horrific results. So, and Galton also did a lot of twin studies. Again, this is yet another thing that we can learn a lot about, but the way it was applied during World War II, it was an atrocity, okay? And people who participated, the people, researchers, doctors, nurses, who did these things, what did they give for their reason for doing this? Did they take responsibility?
It's pretty much always been like the idea that this is for the greater good.
Yeah, this is for the greater good. I was given orders to do that. That was a big thing, and that resulted in something called the Nuremberg trials, where people were called to court, and they were made to confess what they'd done, and they were punished for that. So this idea that these doctors, nurses, researchers, whoever were doing this just because they were following orders, they're like, that's not okay. There needs, you're culpable for this. And so just as an aside, that's something that went on. And events such as the ones that occurred, these atrocities during World War II, played a really big role in establishing what we now refer to as the Institutional Review Board. So it's a governing board that determines, is this research going to harm other people, right? And beyond, not only we don't want to cause harm, right? With like Hippocrates, we don't want to do any harm. We want to try to benefit society when we can, all right? Wow, that's a lot. Galton was busy, yeah? Exhausts me just to talk about him.
Wait, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Do you mind going over statistical correlation, like a little bit more? Like, what is that? I know that you said it was just
Yeah,
give an example.
Sure. And for that, I'm going to roll our handy dandy enormous whiteboard over here. So just take a minute or two as I roll this around. I love it when people ask me stats questions.
There's gonna be math in it.
It's going to be rudimentary math. We'll put like air quote math. How about that? Does that work for you? Okay. All right, so let's take. Correlation means that a bivariate correlation is, how many variables do you think? Very good, okay, so 2 variables. And let's stay in the realm of eugenics, okay, and we're going to look at, this is head size. And this is, let's just say, math ability, okay? All right, so let's say that we want to look for a correlation between math ability and head size. We would get, and we have like 10 people, okay. Everyone's going to get a head size. What's the average head size? Can someone look that up for me? Average circumference of a human head?
centimeters.
55 centimeters?
In like females and 57 in males.
Okay, let's split the difference and say 56. Yeah, exactly, good. So we'll say 56 centimeters. Okay. This is something else we'll talk about in just a moment. Yes, the old bell curve, all right. Uh-oh, we opened up the proverbial bag of worms, right, with this. we won't take too long. So we're going to measure, we're going to get a head size, and we're going to get a score, a math score for everyone, okay? And so each person is going to be represented by a dot. And that's going to be like, okay, this person looks like kind of below average head size, and they score about here, okay? And so let's say that we plot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We plot those 10 individuals, okay? We want to see, is there a correlation between head size and math ability? This is called a scatter plot. What we're looking for is we're looking for the trend of the data. So what do you notice in terms of these dots?
Based off that, it's like, the bigger the head size, the better math ability.
So we're seeing a general positive correlation, right? But then we have, but we're not at a perfect positive correlation. So this would be something kind of like this would be probably a moderate positive correlation between the two variables. Is that enough for right now? Okay, okay.
When I just read like statistical correlation, I was like, what were they comparing, I guess?
Yeah, so that's an example of a correlation, and you can look at correlations among almost infinite numbers of variables. Now, correlation, you might have heard this before, is not the same as causation. So with correlation, all we
Can say is, or all we should say is that it appears that as head size or as head circumference increases, so does mathematical ability. We haven't done an experiment, so we can't say that that's the cause, that's the reason, right? But we can say there's a relationship, there appears to be a strong relationship or association. Now, likewise, what if let's see if we have an eraser here. I feel like I'm going, I'm gonna pop out. No, you didn't find that funny? Okay, coming back around. If we saw something like this, we would say, wow, that's a pretty strong negative correlation. And if we saw something like this, which we would have way more than 10 people, no, Galton, you're so wrong. There's really no correlation between the two. And I think for right now, that's fine to stop. And I'm not going to go into the mean and regression to the mean right now, but we will talk about that. It's actually in our book to talk about later in this chapter. Okay, other questions about stats?
No other questions about Galton? Eugenics? All right. Okay, your turn. I want you to get out a piece of paper and
You're going to define intelligence. So that's your first task, define intelligence. Okay, take another minute. Okay, I would love to hear from you. Provide me with some definitions of intelligence.
Say someone that is thinks critically and is quick to give correct answers and uses their mind and knowledge to the best of their ability.
Wow, that's a lengthy definition. So critical thinking is part of it.
Yeah.
Okay, give me the next ingredient.
I said quick to give correct answers.
Okay. Speedy brain, I'm not sure. Okay, and?
And then I said using their mind and knowledge to the best of their ability.
Okay, using full potential in terms of their brain. All right, okay, good. Someone else.
But how well one, so it could be human, it could be animal, interacts with and manipulates its environment for its own good or survival. I think a lot of times we think of intelligence as being a strictly human
Mm-hmm.
characteristic. I remember reading a book called The Octopus and the Orangutan.
Sorry, could you say that again?
So we always think of intelligence typically as being a human trait.
Sure, sure, and that's where my brain was gonna go today with
I
it,
remember
so.
reading a book called The Octopus and the Orangutan that talked about
Mhm.
animal intelligence
Okay,
and how even if we apply, if we anthropomorphize or provide human characteristics to certain animals,
uh-huh,
they would still, like there was an orangutan that kept escaping from her enclosure.
Mhm.
And she had waited until they turned the lights out at night. She'd stripped the copper wire out, bent it to make a key.
uh-huh,
They caught her once,
Mhm.
took the key away, fixed it, and she kept doing it again. And when they searched, they couldn't find the key. Well, not only all the other traits of intelligence, but she had also learned that, hey, they're gonna come find it. So to deceive her human
Uh-huh.
caretakers, she kept it in her jowl.
wow,
So
that's pretty amazing.
yes, I mean,
Yeah.
not only does that demonstrate, how well she was able to understand
Mhm.
the lock and how she needed to make it, but also interacting with another creature in her environment,
Mhm.
realizing, hey, they think too, this is how they're going to think, and
Mhm.
they're going to just think
Mhm.
one step ahead.
Yeah, yeah, good,
So
okay.
that's why that definition.
And that makes sense. How about one more definition?
I mean, most of my definition, they've kind of already partly said, but one of the things I said, the ability to process information.
Okay.
So I just click this stuff out.
Okay. So processing speed and processing, and how often you get that process right. Okay, anyone else have a definition to offer? Okay. Well, needless to say, intelligence has been defined in myriad
ways over time. And a lot of the early intelligence testing was done, has to do with war. And so the development of psychology, there's a really interesting section in a book I read that talks about how psychology developed through wartime. All right, and so certain things that happened during war spurred psychology to develop in certain ways, and then also vice versa. So I thought that was really interesting. Anyway, I found an IQ test that was given long ago that you needed to do well on to be able to serve, in the Army. So I'm going to have you take it right now, okay? And it's, we'll see how you do. All right, so supposedly this is measuring intelligence. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so we're not going to do that. Let me go out of this for just a second. This is not for a grade, okay? So, oops, that's not right. Let's see, IQ test go to war, that's what I want. Okay, can you see that sort of? Okay, can I do something then? I'm going to send this to you. There are,
It's linked in the PowerPoint.
is it linked to the PowerPoint? Okay, can you open that up and take it? And some of these have helpful hints on here. So what you're going to do is you're going to have the number and then the letter next to it, okay? I just thought this would be fun for you to do. See if you're ready to be a lieutenant or frontline, yes, frontline, with your little musket, right? Just stepping out there. For those of you looking up here, let me know when I need to scroll down, and you can definitely move if you need to when you're looking at this. You can also look back here. It might be easier to see Christina. Is that better? Yes. Okay. It's also back here if it's easier to see. Okay. Uh-huh. I'm going to move this down just a little. How are we doing? Question 17, okay. So let's not look at the solutions yet. I know that you have, yeah, all will be revealed in a moment. That's sort of the fun part. We'll look at the questions first and talk about those. So let's take about 2 more minutes if you are not finished yet. Okay, let's go ahead and look at some of these questions. So, what did you notice as you were taking this? What sorts of questions are in there? No clue?
A lot of it's social. Or cultural.
Is called, okay. And for several of them, you would have to have lived like right during that time, right? So the intelligence test is very dated in that respect. To me, some of them sounded more like moral.
Yeah.
Had to do with morals. What would you do? What else did you notice?
Some of them are judgment too,
Yes,
not necessarily black and white, more of like,
Mm-hmm.
what shade of green is this?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And then let's look at the number 14. Why should food be chewed before swallowing? A, it is better for the health. I would say it probably is. B, it is bad manners to swallow without chewing. Depending on where you are, that may be true. And C, chewing keeps the teeth in condition. And yes, depending on what you chew, those could all be true, right? And so how do we determine what the best answer is? If you're having to determine this and it's going to be whether or not you end up on the front lines, there's a lot at stake, right? That's kind of scary. So I just wanted to illustrate that to you. Let's look back up here and I'm going to read this to you. The Army's use of intelligent tests during World War I lent new credibility to the emerging profession of psychology, even as it sparked public debate about the validity of the tests and their implications for American democracy. Intelligence testing influenced American society long after the war had launched it. The tests were revised for use in school and promoted tracking systems of segregating students into ability groups according to test results. Intelligence testing fueled eugenics programs and were widely invoked by those who pressed successfully to restrict immigration to the United States. All right, so I don't know what would happen to you based on your results, but let's look at the solutions. Okay, so let's see. I don't know if we can pull up both of these. Can someone read the question to me for one? So guys, so we can go through this quickly. If someone can read the questions. What was question 1?
Yeah, I got this totally. Bull Durham is the name of a blank. Chewing gum, aluminum ware, tobacco, clothing.
Okay, and so that was tobacco. Yeah, so if you can just read the question, then we'll look at the answer. Okay.
So don't read all the answer options?
No, you don't need to. Thank you for doing that.
7-Up is played with blank.
Cards, did you do well on that? Good. 3,
The merino is a kind of, or merino, I don't know.
sheep. And I think there was a sheep there, is that right? Okay, so that helped. Number 4,
The most prominent industry of Minneapolis is,
flour.
garnets are usually
Red. How you doing?
not good at all.
Not good, okay.
Not good at all.
Number 6,
The Orpington is a kind of blank.
fowl.
George Ade is famous as a
Author.
soap is made by
B.T. Babbitt.
Laura Jean Libby is known as
A writer.
an air-cooled engine is used in the
Franklin. Did anyone get that right? Oh, right. Oh my goodness. Good job. 11.
a house is better than a tent because
It is more comfortable. Judgment, right? 12.
why does it pay to get a good education?
It makes a man more useful and happy.
That way.
All right, remember that. That'll be on our exam. No, it won't. 13.
If the grocer should give you too much money in change, what is the right thing to do?
Tell him of his mistake. Again, a morality question, right?
Why should food be chewed before swallowing?
It is better for the health.
If you saw a train approaching a broken track, you should.
Signal the engineer to stop the train.
If you are lost in a forest in the daytime, what is the thing to do?
Use the sun or a compass for a guide. How would you do if you had a compass for a guide or the sun? I feel like I would maybe fry in that forest if it was a rainforest. Yeah. Or be eaten by something if I didn't have that travel guide of Galton's. Let's see, 17.
It is better to fight than to run because.
It is more honorable. 18.
Why should all parents be made to send their children to school because?
It prepares them for adult life.
Why do some men who could afford to own a house live in a rented one?
They can make more by investing the money the house would cost.
Why is beef better food than cabbage?
It is more nourishing.
Oh my God, I always
Okay, all right. So don't pass judgment on yourself, but just recognize that this was an actual intelligence test. And how scary is that, right? Okay. Moving on. Who knew we had so many controversies surrounding intelligence, but we do. This is the last thing, everyone.
I will send out an email about the test when it will open and everything. So expect that by tomorrow.
In your lifetime, you have probably stared down any number of ability tests and course exams and PSATs, SATs, ACTs, GREs,
There'll be
GCSEs,
a
whatever
couple
you
of
got in your
questions on
country.
the
Humans,
exam
it
about
seems,
this.
really get a thrill out of measuring, ranking, and comparing each other's intelligence. Unfortunately, as you saw last week, historically, we have been kind of bad at that. Today, we think of intelligence as determined by a series of factors related to genetics, environment, education, perhaps even randomness itself, some aspects of which may correlate with belonging to a particular social group and others not. The key here, though, is that we don't fully understand how or how much some of these factors work. How do elements like personal history and conditions like poverty, access to education, stress, even nutrition affect someone's scores on cognitive tests? And if a group of people shares some of these conditions, how will they respond, both as individuals and as a group, to certain potentially biased intelligence tests? In the end, the irony is that in our ongoing effort to measure human intelligence, most of what we've learned is simply what we don't know. What is a piano? Which one of these things is least like the others? Juice is to glass as hand is to what? Which one of these numbers does not belong in the series? Bernice had X number of jelly beans. She ate one, then gave half of what was left to Bruno. Then she ate another and gave half of the remainder to her dog. Now she only has 5 beans. How many did she have? These questions are similar to what you'd find on today's most widely used intelligence tests, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or WAIS, and the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or WISC. Originally published by psychologist David Wechsler in 1955, the current edition of the exam consists of 15 different subtests that assess things like vocabulary, similarities between objects and concepts, and patterns in letters and numbers. Cognitive tests usually fall into one of two categories: achievement, or the kind that reflect what you've learned, and aptitude, the kind that's supposed to predict your ability to learn something new. So the WAIS and the WISC are aptitude tests, and your final exam at the end of your math class is an achievement test. So how do we know if an intelligence test, or any other test for that matter, is actually any good? Well, today we do have some standards. To be widely accepted, a test must hit 3 important marks. It has to be standardized, reliable, and valid. Standardization is basically about comparability. Whether you answer 15 or 50 questions correctly on a test actually means very little level until you can compare those scores against how others performed. So to achieve meaningful comparisons, test makers must first give the test to a representative sample group, which sets a standard by which to compare future test takers. You've probably heard of a bell curve. Whether you're measuring height or mental aptitude or love of the Beatles, it's often assumed that everyone you're measuring will fall into what's called a normal pattern. Most scores will fall in the mid-range, while fewer hit the extremes. And actually, it's those extremes that intelligence tests are most widely and effectively used for. They might help an educator identify a gifted student who totally blows the roof off a test, but they're also useful in helping clinicians determine who might have a disability or be facing some specific barrier. With victims of traumatic brain injury or stroke, for example, a WAIS test can do a nice job of sussing out whether a patient who's struggling with language actually has a problem remembering and identifying words, or if they're just having a hard time processing the information quickly. But these tests should be regarded more skeptically when it comes to issues that are either way more specific or way more broad. Like, they won't be able to answer questions along the lines of, will Jesse get into Harvard, or are women smarter than men? They're just not designed to do that. And in any case, simply knowing where you fall in a normal curve on a standardized test doesn't mean much if the test is poorly designed. So along with being standardized, a good test has high reliability, meaning it yields dependably consistent results. One way to determine this is to have people take the same test a second time, or some similar version of it. If the two performances resemble one another, if the scores correlate, then the test is thought to have good reliability. And the third requirement for the testing trifecta is simply validity, or the extent to which a test measures or predicts what it's supposed to. And there are different kinds of validity. For instance, if I take the WAIS IQ test and my scores accurately predict how good my grades in college will be, that's a simple kind of predictive or criterion validity. On the other hand, if I take the test and my scores correlate strongly with my results on another similar cognitive test, like the Stanford Binet, that falls under the broad category of construct validity. The key is that all of these are ways to see if a test measures what it claims to measure. But the stickiest wicket of them all is what we make of the test scores themselves. We've all heard plenty about the influence of both nature and nurture in psychology, so the big question is, do our genetics influence our intelligence, or does our environment? And this is an easy question to answer because they both do. And that is important. If the history of intelligence testing has taught us anything, it's that assuming everyone is smart in the same way and for the same reason can lead to disastrously bad conclusions. So let's look at the scientific evidence, and the best place for that is the wealth of twin and adoption studies, which have been fascinatingly helpful in illustrating how genetics and environment can both influence intelligence. For example, research has shown that identical twins who were raised together have the highest rate of similarity in intelligence scores of any group. Fraternal twins who share only half the genes tend to be much less similar in their scores, even when raised in the same home. Likewise, neuroimaging studies show that certain brain regions, like those associated with language, are structurally similar between identical twins and show similar activity while doing the same kinds of mental tasks. The brains of fraternal twins raised in the same home are very similar in some areas, but less so in others. But identical twins who are raised together have the same brain, at least according to neuroimaging scans. Some studies even show that identical twins raised apart from each other show higher intelligence correlation than fraternal twins raised together. And maybe even more interesting is that these intelligence correlations actually increase over time. In one mega study of 11,000 twin pairs in 4 countries, that correlation kept increasing from middle childhood to adolescence to young adulthood and continued to increase through adulthood. Similar research has looked at adopted children and compared their scores with those of their adoptive siblings, parents, and biological parents. And the results can be kind of surprising, because as adopted kids grow up, their mental similarities to their adoptive families actually get smaller over time until there's virtually no correlation by adulthood. Instead, they become more similar in terms of mental aptitude to their biological parents over time, even if they'd never met. In other words, genes appear to matter. You could take 100 kids and raise them in the exact same way, and as adults, they'd still have different aptitudes. But does this mean that when it comes to intelligence, we're all nature and no nurture? Well, luckily, and somewhat obviously, no. Life experiences and environment also matter. One sad example of how early environments affect children can be found in the work of American psychologist J. McVicker Hunt in a destitute Iranian orphanage in the 1970s. Conditions were really bad. Infants received minimal care, and whatever attention they did get was on a routine schedule, never in response to whether they were cooing or crying or anything else. Basically, they were being raised changes with no cause and effect between their behaviors and the responses of their caregivers, and as a result, they didn't learn how to communicate. With no stimulation or social response, the kids were just kind of passive, vacant lumps. Deprivation was essentially trumping any inborn intelligence. So Hunt started a program. He trained caregivers to actually talk to infants, to teach them how to mimic sounds and actions, and eventually sounds and words from their language. The results were tremendous. The kids started to learn really quickly and basically just came alive. While it's an extreme example, Hunt's research showed how malleable early childhood intelligence can be, especially in disadvantaged and stressful conditions. So you can see that environment and heredity interact to affect intelligence, and that some tricky implications can come out of that conclusion. But that's hardly the only controversy when it comes to how we view and measure intelligence. There have been some sensational headline-courting studies of genetic and social influences that have suggested that fundamental differences in intelligence may exist between genders and races, but many of these studies are tangled up in questions of how potential testing bias may affect performance. Basically, if a test inadvertently measures differences caused by cultural experiences or social factors instead of what we might call innate intelligence, then you might say that the test is biased. Extreme example, in the past, immigrants to the US were classified as feeble-minded if they couldn't answer distinctly American questions, like who was the first American president, or what's a milkshake? Today, concerns about bias focus on differences among members of the same general culture. Say, a poor rural kid who might be plenty smart but will test low if questions involve urban upper-class concepts like taking taxis and drinking tea out of giant cups or the rules of tennis. So the questions themselves can skew performance results, but who administers the test can also affect outcomes. Women tend to do better with a fellow female administrator, and African Americans often score higher if their test is given by an African American instructor. And the risk of bias may even fall to the test taker's own expectations. For example, many studies have found that if you give a math test to equally capable men and women, but just before starting you tell the subjects that women usually score lower than men, you actually negatively affect the women's performance. This self-fulfilling concern that you might mess up and inadvertently fulfill some negative stereotype is called stereotype threat. It was first described by social psychologists Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson, and it's been demonstrated frequently across a whole host of interesting studies. Now, we've only scratched the surface of this mess that is intelligence testing. An important thing to remember next time you ace or bomb a test is that you are far more complicated and nuanced than any test score. Don't let a number puff you up or drag you down, and don't let it define you. We all have room for self-improvement. We are all full of infinite, surprising potential. And answers to the questions I asked earlier. A piano is a musical instrument played using a keyboard. The banana is the least similar to the others. Juice is to glass as hand is to glove. The number 2 does not belong in the series, and Bernice began with 23 jelly beans. Today, your intelligent mind learned how we currently use WAIS and WISC tests to measure intelligence, and how important it is that a test be standardized, reliable, and valid. We also looked at how genetics, environment, testing bias, and stereotype threat can affect IQ test performance. Thank you for watching.
Okay, everyone, thanks so much for your attentiveness during class. Have a great weekend. Look for that email from me, and I will see you on Tuesday.